Welcome to the Inside Outside podcast. This is the podcast that goes behind the scenes of the programmatic and outdoor advertising industry. I'm your host, Karan Singh, GM for the UK at Vistar Media, the home of Out of Home. And this is episode 1 of our new podcast, Have We Forgotten to Be Consumers? And who better to take us through this than industry legend, a good mate of mine, Mr. Simon Peel, the Global VP of Media at Haleon and formerly VP of Media at Adidas. Welcome, Simon.
Hello, mate. Nice to be here.
How's it going?
Yeah, very well. It's very hot in this room, but apart from that, yeah, very good.
That's it, mate. The lights suit you. This could be a new career.
I hope so, yeah.
Well, that's it. And speaking of careers, getting into this, can you tell us a little bit about why you got into the industry? You could have been anything. You could have been a marathon runner, astronaut, like anything, and you chose our industry.
Yeah, I don't think I could have been a marathon runner or an astronaut, but that's kind of you to say. Yeah, I got into advertising about 25 years, not quite 25 years ago. And I did it on the back of work experience that I had when I was at uni. So my uncle was one of the managing directors at an agency called Total Media. He ran the outdoor department, like the production part of that. And one summer I got like an internship, but Total Media wouldn't let me join them to do the internship. So in Total Media's office, there was like this very specific media agency that looked after record labels. And I went there and they were basically like getting hammered at lunchtime and going to gigs in the evening. So it seemed like an amazing career. And much more interesting than looking at sort of creative side of things to me. So that was the attraction of getting into advertising, was this ill-reputed media agency looking after record labels and getting pissed at lunchtime.
It sounds better than the internship I got. My mum signed me up one summer to go work at an estate agent. And that was that sealed that off as a no-go for me for life.
You didn't fancy being an estate agent?
No, it wasn't that. But then sometimes I look at it and I'm like, maybe that was the career that I could have chosen. So was there any, obviously growing up, the advertising industry is very consumer-facing, right? We engage with consumers and people, right? What kind of campaigns or ad campaigns really stuck out from your childhood or more recently that you kind of looked at and think those are like, best in class?
I remember there was this really addictive radio ad, which I won't sing the jingle to, but I remember when my mum would take us kids shopping on a Saturday to Guildford. So we're from like Hampshire, and Guildford was like the big town you go to. And there was always this radio for like county kitchens, which were apparently the best kitchens in the county. And I still can't get that sort of jingle out of my head, but I think ads back those days, like they seem to be much more memorable, but I don't know if that was because I was a kid and you're being exposed to those things. Latterly, I think advertising's getting a worse rep because of like the proliferation of ads. Like it essentially funds the internet, or funds a large proportion of the internet. And I think because of that and the way that advertising works on the internet, people have got a bit pissed off with it. It becomes kind of background noise, and it's quite irritating. Actually, it's been irritating for a while. So I think there has been this movement from a point of like when advertising was great to a point now where it's a little bit more irritating. One of the really good ads that I kind of always remember is like the Orange Wednesdays activity, like having a great ad, and I think it was called the Gold Spot just before the film came on. And obviously, like not everyone, but you used to go to the cinema. When you're younger, between the ages of 16 and 34, you tend to go to the cinema more often. And it was always the spot that really stood out. And it used to be something that you not would look forward to necessarily, but it was something that you didn't mind watching. It was kind of entertaining.
Yeah, it kind of added to the experience, right, rather than taking away. And I think it's an interesting change. And I think I've seen that coming from a more display CTV-focused place to outdoor, where everything's more around the creative and impact and make things impactful. And it's quite refreshing to go back. And I love asking that question because, no one's favorite ad is a display ad, right? The ones that capture the attention are a lot of the traditional channels, right? But just doing cooler stuff. And it's interesting to see marketers, I'd love to see marketers go back to that and actually start putting the relationship with the consumer back at the heart of what they're doing rather than kind of putting numbers to everything. Do you think we've gone too far down that kind of rabbit hole?
What, the numbers rabbit hole?
Yeah, just trying to measure absolutely everything and
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, it's difficult when you look back at like the history of advertising. So before we came on, I was preparing for one of the questions, and I was looking at something by Claude Hopkins, who wrote a book called Scientific Advertising in 1923, and then they were talking about how you measure things and how. I mean, back then they were saying, "Oh, we're now in a position where we understand everything about the consumer." It's like, well, bullshit. Of course you don't. Because they didn't then, we don't now. I think there is a requirement for advertising to be more accountable and more measurable because the investments are so high. So, the advertising industry, I think, is worth about $1 trillion now, or next year it's estimated to be about that, which in itself is a huge economy. And those investments that often come from advertisers, they flow through agencies, they go to media owners. There's all the shareholders that are involved in that as well. So people want to know that those investments that they're making are going to deliver some sort of beneficial outcome, so that both the companies involved, or all of the companies involved, and the shareholders behind that are getting returns. So I don't know if it's become too measurable. I think it's become too focused on specific KPIs that don't necessarily mean what people think they mean, and they become the focal point because we forget the objective behind it, which is, to grow the brands, to be memorable, to create fame, not to piss people off, and ultimately to make money. And instead, we focus on these silly KPIs that are more easy to achieve, but have less meaning and less substance.
yeah, that last click and things like that, right?
Last click. Before that was impressions, right? Like if you think of that, was buying impressions, that's crazy. But I mean, even to a degree nowadays, viewability, verification has gone that way. Like all of these KPIs that start off with the good intent tend to be gamed because you realise how to do it. You optimise towards it, and then by default they become less effective.
Yeah, for sure. And you can't cheat in out of home, Simon, because you can just go see your ad. That's how you verify in our space.
Very good. You can in Italy, by the way, where people put up dodgy posters around the back. But yeah. No, I agree. Out of home is one of those formats that people can really see the ad. They can see that the consumers can see the ad, and hopefully they can see that it's effective as well.
I think you're right. We need to strike a balance, right? And I think programmatic gives us that degree of measurability and that degree of flexibility, but sometimes I feel like it can take us too far down that path of trying to measure everything down to the finite details. And I don't think that's necessarily the end goal. And I guess it goes back to your point around, understanding the KPIs that matter and setting those appropriately, right?
Yeah. I don't think programmatic provides all the measurable answers, if we're very honest, when it comes to how the supply path works and the amount of third-party vendors that are involved, and then how contractual clauses obfuscate the supply path and how there's hops between vendors within the supply path. So I'm not sure. I know where you're going with it, but I don't necessarily think programmatic is entirely measurable. It's certainly not transparent. But yeah, there is a danger, I think, that we try to measure the wrong things. And, by trying to measure everything, we forget that we're trying to focus on a particular strategy, or we're trying to get a creative idea across, or we're trying to get a specific effect from people and consumers. So I think by trying to measure everything, you kind of forget that you're trying to get to something specific.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what we get sometimes with again, with programmatic, some of those bad actors creating that kind of opaqueness that we have in the industry, or making things too measurable because it suits a third-party agenda rather than actually that relationship between the brand and the consumer, is where things start to fall down. Like for me, programmatic done well is just an automation and a facilitator of doing things creative at scale. So the ability to switch things on when the weather changes, or if the pollen count gets to a certain degree, or the creative in a certain venue because the demographic changes. Think of gyms, right? And the daytime crowd versus the after work crowd. That's when creative starts to add value. Programmatic, starts to add value. I think it's like, from people within the programmatic space need to start kind of like thinking more about how they add value to the people they're working on behalf of, rather than necessarily their own agendas, which is what happens all too much.
Yeah, I do think ad tech vendors do try to push that agenda. I don't think that's necessarily where the problem is. I think the problem is it ironically, I think the problem with programmatic is that it's open to everyone and it's obscured by some very bad actors and some liberally bad actors as well. Like some people are not really that terrible. They're just trying to make money. But the accessibility of advertising or the democratization of advertising also makes it really shit, because everything just blends into itself. And again, when you're a consumer and you're trying to read the news, to have to endure an endless amount of advertising that may or may not be relevant makes it frustrating, I think, as a consumer. But when you get the advertising that's relevant for you at the right time with the right message, in the right environment, it begins to have more relevance, and I think has a larger impact as a consequence of that. So yeah, I think programmatic can do both of those things, and it can do both of them very well. It can obfuscate stuff really well, and it can be very creative with its use of the systems as well.
For sure. And, I guess taking it back to, right message, right place, right time, so the very basics of advertising, has being in the industry ruined advertising in totality for you? Can you still enjoy adverts for what they are, or do you look at things too kind of like forensically?
I kind of think of the people that work in advertising, and this is probably total bullshit, but I tend to think that it's a craft, and then you've got to learn your craft. Like when I got into the industry, I remember the agency that I worked for at the time, I think it was Mindshare at the time, might be Mediacom that forced it, but everyone had to go through a grad scheme, and you all had to go through the IPA program, and then if you wanted to, you could go on to the next level of the IPA program. And there seemed to be at the time a real craft. It's like the Chartered Institute of Marketing in the UK as well. There's a real craft to it. So I kind of think of it like a craft, and you're trying to understand different components like you would with a different craft. I don't know where I'm going with this metaphor, but essentially, like if you're a carpenter, just because you like a certain piece of wood or a certain tool doesn't mean that's all you're going to be working on for the rest of your career. You've got to learn different parts of it and how it all works together, and you can create a lovely table or whatever it is you're making. I think it's the same with advertising. It's a craft, and you've got to learn the different components, think about how things work together, and then try not to get too pissed off with the way that the ecosystem operates. I also think that, like with all things that you start out with, it could be football. When you're a kid, you really love to play football. I imagine for some professional footballers, as they go through their career, they get more and more pissed off with football, because it's not just about the craft of playing football and learning skills and getting the stamina up. It's also about the business behind it all, and that if you don't understand that and understand how that operates, it could probably get quite frustrating. I think it's the same.
Yeah, it moves from a passion, right? Like I think about it when I was playing sports as a kid, I used to play cricket. And I remember coming home from school and I would be desperate all day at school, be thinking about the game that was happening afterwards. And I would be as excited for training because you're passionate about that craft. And it's how do you translate that to what you do for a living? Like how do you stay passionate about what you do like day to day? Because that's key to it, right?
Yeah, well, I guess, it's an element to it. I don't know if it's the key. I think one of the most important, probably the analogy with you with cricket, right? Like, was also you had heroes to aspire to, or people that maybe you're a batter and you're trying to copy a technique. It's kind of similar with advertising, like I look at some of the industry figures that we've got, who are they've had fantastic careers and they're really important to the industry and the way that we operate going forward. And I think to have those sort of mentors or people that you look up to and think about how they would direct things. Really important. So as an example, like Sue Unerman, who's recently gone to Brain Labs as the Global Chief Strategy Officer. She was at MediaCom for a number of years, and she was like a really important person at MediaCom, but also within the wider industry. Like she's written books on equality. She's talked about how strategy really informs not just advertising, but marketing and actually wider life as well. So, and there are lots of people like Sue in the industry. There's Karen Black here, also in MediaCom and Group M, but there's lots of people like that. Steve King at Publicis, like you could go on and on and on, but there's lots of people that you can aspire to that help give you a sense of reality when you're working through the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And one of those heroes, and I was excited to ask you about this question actually, is I know you're a fan of Les Binet and the long and short of it. Is that still relevant, or is it past its sell-by date today?
I think it's really relevant.
What is it broadly like?
Well, the long and short of it.
Yeah, like what's the broad?
Les and Peter brought out a series of, I think it was 4 books, and the first one everyone forgets the name of, which I think is something like Digital in the Accountability Era, something like that. I buggered it up. But long and short of it was the second, then it was Media and Focus, and then Effectiveness and Context. And long and short of it is the one that gets the most communication around it, and essentially says if you're to grow businesses both in the short and the long term, which is what most businesses want, then you need to distribute your weight of advertising and marketing communications in favour of long-term brand building, which accepts that people aren't in market when you're advertising or you're communicating. Just because you're advertising a pair of trainers or sneakers doesn't mean I'm going to go out and buy them because I bought a pair yesterday or last week, so I might buy them in 6 months' time.
It's a 95-5 rule, right? It's like your customers are in market for your goods 5% of the time.
Yeah, I think that was LinkedIn that came up with that one, which is more related to business. But I think it's true. When we looked at the stat, when I worked previously at Adidas, we looked at the stats and it was confirmed. I work at Haleon at the moment. One of the first things we looked at was how often do people buy the product and whether Pareto's law is true and is not. So that idea, it's also in Ehrenberg Bass's Institute of Marketing Science data as well, which says, most people aren't in market when you advertise. But the long and short of it basically says you should build brand building over the long term, brand equity over the long term, ideally with emotional messages that stand out, because the people, consumers, us, we have a greater susceptibility to emotional messages. If I make someone upset or if I make someone happy, they're more likely to remember me than if I say, do you want to buy a pen? Do you know what I mean? So you should do that disproportionately to short-term activation, which is, do you want to buy a pen? It's blue, it's grey, and it's at half price, which is more about targeting people that are in market now for your product. Your question was whether that's still relative, because it's like the long and short of it is 10 years old. I think it came out in 2014.
But also the landscape's changed, right? So we've got and the reason I asked that question for context is more around, we see a different type of client base in terms of brands we work with. So we've got global brands like yourselves, but we also have like brands that are kind of mid-size who might not have been able to access, out of home or some of the big traditionally brand building channels. Is it as relevant for them now that we have a lot more companies with the, coming through online, etc.? Is it still as relevant as it has been before?
Of course it is. I mean, there was I think it was a good case study a few years ago about it's in Monzo Bank, where when they were trying to disrupt the banking industry in the UK, they primarily went in with digital advertising, right? Like tightly targeting people, getting them to sign up, but they plateaued in terms of their growth. And they just couldn't grow, they kept on pumping money into performance advertising and digital specifically, and they just couldn't grow. So I don't know who their agency was, but with their agency, they decided to start investing into TV and out of home and other media channels, other communication channels outside of media as well. And then they saw the bump in growth. And I think that's true of a lot of these sort of smaller to medium-sized enterprises, that they start with digital because it's a really low cost entry, as we talked about earlier. But the growth that they will get will plateau over a period of time. So then they need to look at expanded reach, because that's, how are you going to grow without penetration? You need to grow more. You need to get more people to buy more of the product, and you're not going to do that by targeting the same people over and over again. Like loyalty is great, but it's not going to grow your business exponentially. So yes, the long and short of it for me is still relevant for SMEs, and personally, I really like the long and short of it because it exemplifies life. Like if you look at Mark Carney's book, who's the former Chancellor of the Bank of England. I don't know, no, not Chancellor, sorry, the former head of the Bank of England. He wrote a book called Values, and it's all about the long and short of it. If you look at Warren Buffett's strategic portfolio, he bases it on something by a guy called John Bogle, John Bogle's financial strategy is something called 60-40. So like this is from like 50 years ago. The long and short of it is just it's taking that foundation that exists elsewhere in the world and it's just applying it to advertising. And it's similar thoughts. You have to grow over the long term and prepare for the long term, like a pension or a portfolio. Yeah. And then at the same time, you want to go out and spend money now, or you want to save money now. So yeah, I think it's just as relevant now as it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that drew me in to this space, specifically programmatic out of home, was the fact that it allowed us to democratize that for SMEs. So historically, where you'd have a big brand go to a big media owner via a specialist or someone like that and buy all the big spots over a long period of time, that was kind of out of reach for customers to do exactly that, right? And build their brand as well as, investing in more performance-based channels. And that's actually been one of the things that's been most kind of uplifting for me, having been in this space, is actually opening that up. So I think that's an interesting point, and I completely get why it's so important, right, to build that emotional connection with customers, right?
Yeah, and out of home does that. I think to your point with SMEs, I think that's a really valid point, that they haven't been able to get, you can buy a 6-sheet round the corner at a bus stop and it's going to cost you 500 quid or whatever the price is at the moment. But you can't buy it on scale because you need an agency or you need a shitload of money to be able to do that. I do think like Vistar offers that ability to get into advertising at scale through out of home that probably didn't exist previously.
For sure. And then to wrap things up, speaking of putting up a 6-sheet round the corner from your house, if you could put an ad anywhere in the world, one placement, where would you put it and why?
So I was thinking about this on the way over, and initially I was going to do something crass, like I was going to say, Wembley Stadium, do it on the pitch, that'd be amazing. But I was thinking about the best out of home that I've ever seen. It also comes from the same advertiser. One was like 20 years ago, and one was a few years ago. And a few years ago, PlayStation, when they were launching, I think it was PS5 maybe, they took over like London Underground, and they changed the sign of the London Underground to the PlayStation,
the logo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you had like the triangle and the square, and that was amazing. And they did that in other locations as well. Like London gets a lot of visibility, but I think they did it in Shanghai, Tokyo, Madrid. But years and years ago, like I was at a festival once, like a dance festival, and dance festivals are a certain type of environment. And I remember there was an advertiser handing out Rizzlers, but also what's the thing you roll joints, like the little thing that you put in joint. What is it? Tips. I don't know. So the thing that you put at the end of a joint to make sure that your lips didn't burn, right? So PlayStation gave out a whole rack of these to everyone that went in. Brilliant. So that they were aware of who their consumers were. Like they were 16 to 22-year-old kids who were probably gaming at home and probably smoking weed. Well, maybe smoking weed. And I just remember seeing it and thinking like they really understood their audience. Yes. Yeah, I'm not saying that would be ideal for Haleon.
Yeah.
or
maybe it is.
No, I'm not going to suggest that for them. And hopefully I won't get in trouble for even talking about it. But I think the idea of it is like you understand your audience and you understand like it's not necessarily about the biggest advert in the world. It's about what's most creative and relevant.
Yeah, and it's funny because those are the ones that live long in the memory, right? Which always top and tail that question with your favourite ad and where we place it. So that's a nice full circle moment. I think we are out of time. But Simon, thank you so much for coming on and being our first guest on the Inside Outside podcast. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.